To tell that to little Asian kids who are going to school being told don't make a noise because, they might be called China virus or Kung Fu, that is everything. And that is the power of Jeremy's example.
It's the most impossible thing I think I've ever witnessed in my life.
We spoke to Frank Chi, the director of the new HBO documentary 38 at the Garden. This is a film that is so much bigger than basketball. It's about where we are today as a society.
Why did you choose to produce this film specifically? And obviously there has been, a previous documentary that was made about, the larger Linsanity picture, like a very fully fleshed version out of that. So what was your reasoning behind pursuing this?
This moment, man, this is not a fun time to be Asian American right now. And as we're revisiting the 10th anniversary of what is still my favorite Asian American memory during the worst time to be Asian American in recent history, it's important, one, to remind people that anything is possible, especially if you're a kid and you haven't seen that before, right? That's just really important to do that. But two, send a larger statement about stereotypes, right? I have a way of describing 38 at the Garden without any basketball whatsoever. I'll just be real with you. It's part one is about stereotypes. Part two is about what happens when someone shatters those stereotypes in front of the world stage. And part three is about today, when those stereotypes are weaponized. And when they're weaponized, they turn into anti-Asian violence, right? It's pretty actually, look, if you're Asian, you know that instinctively. That obviously, you don't need that explained to you. Just like how I never really need to explain what Linsanity meant to Asian people, right? When I'm talking to people about it with Asian people, it's just never explained. But as all experiences bear out, you have to talk about it with other people about why it meant so much. And that's how we have a conversation. And I think we achieved that and will continue to achieve it with 38 at the Garden. It's been out for a couple of days now. I think the secret is out that it's way bigger than basketball, right? The way people are having this conversation is not about, how did Jeremy's season end? Or what happened for the rest of his career? It's about what it's like to be Asian in America. Right? I've had so many people come up to me afterwards and they're like, man, I'm thinking about myself, right? I'm thinking about, I had this young woman come up to me a couple of days ago after our last screening before the airing, and she was she's probably in her mid-20s, and she was just like, I'm just thinking about every meeting I've ever been in. I think about how deep that is, man. Every meeting I've ever been in, those stereotypes that try to define Asian people in Western society at large, especially in the United States, they follow us around, right? We walk into a meeting, they're there. We walk into a classroom, we walk down the street, we walk into a party. All those stereotypes are haunting us because all these other people are trying to put us in those boxes, right? And what is the definition of breaking that box if you're Asian, right? And this is actually sort of how the birth of this idea came about. It was 2020, and I was having this conversation with Trayvon Free, one of the producers. Trayvon's not Asian. So again, I haven't probably ever explained what Linsanity meant to me to somebody, period, right? I haven't probably talked about it in years, to be honest with you. I just, I'm one of those people who I would go on YouTube and if I needed to pick me up, I'll watch the Linsanity videos, right? And I told him about it in the context of an impossible moment, right? What is a moment when society at large assigns to a group of people saying, you can't do this, and then someone comes out of nowhere and shatters it to pieces. And we were talking about it in the context of Obama becoming president, because that's objectively the biggest impossible moment any of us have ever lived through. So we were like, yo, what other feelings feel like that? And I'm like, man, I'm Asian, bro. There's only one, and it's Linsanity. And I told him about my night that Jeremy dropped 38 at the Garden. That's actually why we called it 38 at the Garden, right? It's two most magical nights of my life. The first is the night that Obama was elected president. And the second is the night that Jeremy dropped 38 at the Garden, hence the title. It certainly was for me. So that's what I was assuming for a lot of the other people who were freaking out. And I tell this story to Trayvon, he's like, man, how is that not a movie? Linsanity from the Asian fans' perspective. How is that not a movie? And you've seen the movie by now. You know the first part of the section. The movie is called Doubt. Mm-hmm. Right? The first thing I did when he said it to me about it, I was like, man, that happened 8 years ago. Nobody cares what Asian people think in this country. We're invisible. And credit to Trey, he didn't push me, right? But I thought about it for a couple of weeks. And at this point, we don't know Jeremy at all. This is an idea of ours. But this is 2020, so like anti-Asian violence is already starting to pick up. And I thought about it and I was like, look, if Jeremy's down and we branch this story out and talk about the larger community, talk about what it's like to be Asian in this country, especially during such a hostile time, then we got to do it. We got to try to find a way to make this real. So I go back to Trayvon a couple weeks later and I was like, yo, I made a deck. 38 Garden is a deck now, okay? So we talked to Samir Hernandez, who is the other producer on this movie, and Samir knows like every athlete in America, man. I mean, he's the most connected dude you could find, and within 1 degree of separation, he's on the film, Jeremy. And talking to him was a really eye-opening experience, because I think if you talk to somebody who is a symbol for a lot of people, you almost forget that they're human, man. That's the burden of being a symbol. And I just had to remind myself that this is like a human being. And he was talking about how, like, look, during that stretch, I'm just trying to survive. I think I'm gonna get cut every day. I'm not thinking about the societal impact of a bucket, right? He's just trying to make it in the league. He's sleeping on couches. So, and then he was like, later, as I carved out a space for myself in the league, I'm trying to not let Linsanity define me. I want a whole career where people talk about other things. So he didn't talk about Linsanity for a while because of it. So to hear him talk about that was really, like, I think good for me and for our producers, because like it's just important to remind people of like the humanity behind becoming a symbol for people. But when we got to the part where, like, you know, like we're gonna land this on the larger story of Asian Americans and not land this on your personal story, he was like, that's the only way I would do it. You know what I mean? It's like we got to land this where people are thinking about themselves, and not thinking about, you know, how Jeremy left the Knicks, which I have plenty of opinions about, but it's not in the movie.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Because we don't want people to think about it. We want them to think about themselves. We want them to think about what it's like to be Asian in this country during such a hostile time, right? It's a movie like that. Its core is about stereotypes. And once we got going, man, it was sort of just like, you know, that was like, we officially signed Jeremy on like summer 2021. Our first shoot was October 2021. It was less than a year ago. So it's been a very fast process.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the story of the birth of 38 at the Garden as an idea.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you for opening up about all of that. And I think, like, yes, it's 38 minutes, but it's hard to realize that it's only 38 minutes. Like, it does feel like it, you know, it spans a lot longer than that. And, you know, I was even showing it. I was at my sister's place yesterday, showing it to all of her friends, and my sister even said this myself. She's like, "Oh, I didn't even know." Like, she's not a sports fan. She obviously knows who Jeremy Lin is because I always talk about him, and you know, obviously, like, you know the name. She never like put a face to the name ever. So to her, it was just like there was just this picture in her imagination of who Jeremy Lin was and like what he did. And I think now being able to see it from that perspective, where it's like, yes, it's basketball, but it's not, right? And then think that's like what it's like. Oh, I understand. I grew up the same way. Yes, I experienced it a different way. I pursued a different route, but it's still the same thing.
Right.
And that's why, like, I think it's so interesting how, you know, especially the beginning and the end, where you intertwine all of these different types of elements of Asian American society. And I kind of wanted to touch upon, like, what were the reasons specifically you thought, like, you know, bringing Ronnie, Hassan, and like Jenny onto the story to help tell it from their perspective, and obviously very unique and different perspectives, but also adding a lot of realness and a lot of, also at the same time, you know, comic nature to it. So how did that help? And like, what was your thought process between, I'm sure there was like so many people you thought of, like, in a short list of, like, you know, who you could have asked. Why did you end up choosing them?
Man, I actually just said this. I get that question a lot because it's an HBO product. It's in front of millions of people. People think that, like, we had a long runway and unlimited budget or something. No. Who do we pick to be in the movie? Who said yes? Yeah, I'm dead serious. This was a scrappy project up until HBO saw it spring out in January of this year. You know, as real as possible, right? And then the minute they got hopped on it, I mean, they've been nothing but incredible to us, right? But let's keep it a buck, man. Like, it's hard making movies, right? It was hard raising money. You know, even with someone like Jeremy attached, who's one of the most famous Asian Americans, period, it was hard. I mean, we had 2 really big places turn us down that we thought were sure bets, you know? And then we were like, well, then we just got to raise the money on our own. So we raised enough money to film 8 interviews. And then we And then we put together a very rough string out, and that's when HBO heard about it. And we put it in front of them. They're like, don't shop it around. Right? That's literally how, before that happened, it was scrappy as hell. So who said yes? And we said, okay, let's go. Right? But, look, I think it's a good reminder for folks of just like how projects come together, right? Because not everybody sees your vision. And I think a lot of athletes probably can relate to that too. Not everybody sees your vision. You see your vision, right? You'll find people who believe in your vision, right? And then when you surround yourself with the people who believe in your vision and you keep at it, something will come about. Something will come about. It doesn't work out perfectly every time. Something will come about.
Yeah. And I think one thing that, Hassan, really touched upon, like in this piece was, the whole thing about like what, being an Asian man and this Asian American man in this society means. And, you have that whole list of all those things that, you're associated with. And, Jeremy just in itself of being a basketball player at the NBA level is completely going against like that doesn't fit any of those molds. So I'd love to hear like your perspective on, kind of, how this story also, portrays like a different sense of like what Asian masculinity can mean here in America.
I think sports relationship with Asian Americans, and this is why I love AMAZN so much, to be honest with you, like sports' relationship with Asian Americans is just more important than other professions, to be totally honest, because it is a direct refutation of the stereotypes that are placed on Asian people, especially Asian people. Right? You can't play whatever. You're going to be the last kid picked, on the playground when they have to choose teams, right? You're weak. You could be bullied, right? The way to combat that is to see a lot of Jeremy Lin's, right? Take the stereotype that most impacts you and break it, right? That is like the role sports can play in Asian American society. I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, I say this all the time. I'm like, I need every single Asian kid to play sports and like drop the violin and the piano. Never touch it again. Pick up a ball, right? Like, we need not everybody's gonna end up scoring 38 at the Garden, right? But you're gonna end up breaking stereotypes on your own. You're gonna feel great about it, right? And that, like, I've had a lot of conversations today. I mean, like this press run about supportive parents, right? Because a lot of Asian people don't have supportive parents. They're gonna make you play the violin, right? And like I've always in my head been like, well, it just if only Asian parents supported their kids playing sports, and then we'll have a lot more Jeremy Lin's. And then like I've got a lot of feedback from people like, like even if you have supportive parents, like you internalize society's stereotypes. Because you feel it on the outside. You don't just feel it inside at home. You feel it outside too. And I think like that's where like Jeremy's story matters most, right? Because Jeremy had really supportive parents, right? I mean, you saw they have those "We Believe" shirts on in Doc. Like how that's the ultimate. Like I can't believe that as an Asian kid that didn't have supportive parents for sports. Like my parents made me quit cross country in high school to make me study for SATs, right? Like that's my experience. Unfortunately that's the norm, right? So like once you overcome that and you do have supportive parents playing sports, then you got to deal with society. And that's also what we show a lot in the movie, right? We show him being California State Player of the Year and winning the California State Championship and getting 0 recruitment letters, right? We show him having to go to a D1 school like Harvard on no athletic scholarship, being a 3-time All Ivy League, averaging 18 points a game, and not even get a whiff of interest from a team to draft him, even though he killed it in the combine, right? And you're like, what? Like what? Like the only reason why he got in the NBA, we talk about this in the movie, is because Joe Lacob, who just bought the Warriors at the time, saw him play because Jeremy used to play against Joe Lacob's son in high school all the time. So he saw him play. He didn't look at him stereotypically from a pre-draft notes, right? I mean, the pre-draft notes for Jeremy are hilarious. If you know him and you know how he plays, he's always played like this. He plays downhill. He's a locomotive. Get out of his way, right? He'll take a shot. He'll dunk on you. That was true in high school, in college. And if you read these NBA pre-draft notes, we put this in the movie too. It says, lacks confidence, constantly passing the ball. are you just writing down Asian stereotypes on paper? Right? So like, even if you do have supporting parents, you have society you have to confront. And Jeremy's example is when you confront that society and this wall of stereotypes around you, you find every crack in that wall, you just keep pushing and pushing and pushing until the wall comes down. That's what it means for me when he checks into the Nets game, right? He's about to get cut. He just slept on Landry Fields' couch, right? He checks into the game, and that wall comes down. Mm-hmm. So that to me is the power of sports, and what I think Asian kids playing sports have to deal with. It's not just about having supportive parents. It's about then, after having supportive parents, after determining what your goal and your vision is, seeing how society confronts you, and then you still got to go confront that, and then you got to beat that, right? That's, to me, is probably the universal story of every Asian athlete.
Yeah. And another thing that was interesting was that I think this is like the first time I heard Jeremy ever say that story about I think he said it was like when he first joined the Knicks, and they brought him aside and like, why do you play like a Japanese
cartoon character?
I've never heard that story. Yeah, I mean, like, I'm sure like you probably hadn't heard that story either. Like, what was your like impression just hearing that?
I mean, I'm not surprised, unfortunately, right? Are you surprised? It's outrageous, but like, God, I'm thinking about all the things people have said to me throughout my life in any capacity, right? Like, what? Sometimes it doesn't even register as it's happening. You're like, wait, what? And then after, you're like, that's fucked up, right? I mean, like, that's something that all Asian people in this country can relate to. And just, I think a lot of it is too, it's like, like, we don't really get a lot of attention in the conversation with America. That's just the reality, right? And when somebody forces that attention onto the community, onto them, because of their sheer exploits, right? That's what Linsanity is. People don't have the tools to talk about it, right? That's why, like, like, to me, Linsanity, and we don't talk about this in the movie because we transitioned immediately to the modern day, but like, to me, Linsanity ended with chink in the armor. You remember that headline on ESPN, right? You're like, what? Right? And here's the thing, and maybe this is a good segue into talking about why we made this movie and pivoted to the modern day. We were thinking about making that the transition point to talking about modern day stuff in the movie. And then we were, at some point, I was like, this doesn't even compare to people dying, to people getting like, stabbed and like slashed and beat on the street. Like in the most fucked up way I could say this, like, it almost, when I was editing that section, I almost was like, damn, I missed the days when like getting called chink in the armor was the biggest deal. How messed up is that? I'll be real with you. Okay, because like I was like, oh, I mean, you know what's happening in the news. I think you probably know what it's like to walk into a subway at night, know where you got to stand so you don't get pushed off, right? Like comparing that with where we were 10 years ago and not knowing how to understand something like Linsanity that disrupted the conversation of America. Anti-Asian violence is something that disrupted the conversation of America. People didn't know how to handle it. People didn't know how to talk about it. People still don't know how to talk about it. They know it's wrong. Like, oh my God, like, this is such an awful phenomenon. We need this to end. It's like, you know where it started? It started with stereotypes. Those stereotypes have been around. They follow us around. They weren't weaponized until the last couple of years. But that's what anti-Asian violence is it's the weaponization of the stereotypes that have been around for over a century. Right? And like, once we wanted to say that very loud and very clearly through making this documentary. I think we achieved that.
Yeah. And obviously, like 10 years ago, and even before that, Jeremy himself had to deal with all of these types of stereotypes, right, growing up, and as he progressed through the league, even still. And like 10 years later, as I'm having these conversations with all of these athletes that are playing high level, Division I basketball, professional basketball, it's all still here. So from like your perspective, from like the way you were trying to tell a story, like why, like what has changed? Like obviously, like in terms of, I know awareness has changed. Like what is like how is it like so sad, but also like like obviously still a learning point that, we're still seeing these things 10 years later, and kind of where can we go from here?
In some ways it's gotten worse, right? And I think a lot of this is about the mood of the country. That's the way I always think about it, right? After Barack Obama wins, we think we're in this new era of like multicultural good feeling, right? Obama's America, multi-ethnic democracy. Like this is how moods are set, national moods, right? And I certainly was, beholden to that. I started my career in politics, and I did it as an act of belonging because I saw Obama speak, right? That ended for me in 2014, 2015. And the era that we live in now, which is much darker, right? That's when it started. And we have to look at sort of Linsanity in the context of what it felt like when it happened in like multicultural Obama America versus reassessing it now in like this, very, very divided, dark period in our country's history. That's why it feels like we're regressing, right? There was a report put out by the Asian American Foundation this year, and it sort of broke me, to be honest with you. It said that in 2021, 20% of Americans saw Asians as more loyal to their country of origin than the United States. And in 2022, just 1 year later, that number jumped from 20% to 31%. 11% jump in 1 year, right? So is it getting worse? Yeah, right? It's all about the national mood, right? It felt like it could be getting better when Obama was around, and now everything feels like it's getting worse. For Asian people, it's a very unique experience, but it's one that we're going to talk about, at least through this movie, very, very loudly. I don't know if I have an answer for you, right? Like, I can't control the national mood, neither can you. But we can do our work. We can do our work. And as storytellers, I think it's important to tell as many stories that break through as possible about these issues and to give people like some sustenance for the soul, because we all got to just get through this and make a better world, right?
Yeah.
I feel like you definitely feel that way through the work that you do. I definitely feel that way through mine. So despite whatever the polls might tell us, despite the fact that it feels that we're going backwards, we just have to keep on doing good work.
No, definitely. And then, last thing for you is, I know you touched about it a little bit. It's about like, how like 2012, he didn't want to be known by Linsanity. He just wanted to be known as like, oh, I'm a basketball player. I'm not this Asian American basketball player. It's like, and like you said, even when he was still in the league, he was largely forgotten by a lot of people. He still wanted to be known for more than what that was. But today, like what does Linsanity mean to Jeremy now?
I'll let Jeremy answer that question. I can't say.
From your interview to the film and just your conversations with him, how is that perspective?
Well, I'll tell you what, he's embracing his role as a symbol of hope for a lot of people in ways that he didn't before. He's been very open about that. The movie is a product of that, right? Recognizing the power of being a symbol, leaning into it, and giving hope. My favorite tweets in the 48 hours that this movie has been out have been like the ones about their kids, because that's sort of an unintentional audience. I honestly thought I was making a millennial nostalgia movie. Like, I thought we were like, like if you were in your mid to late 20s back then, you're gonna love this movie. I thought that was our key audience. Like, it's not. Like, the unintentional audience is actually the most important audience for kids. Like if you're 10 years old, you weren't around when Linsanity happened. If you're 15, you probably don't remember it. And for kids to see that, to relive it as closely as they could, to get the perspective on what it means to grow up here right now, that is everything. That means anything is possible, right? And I think I'm grateful for Jeremy for going on that journey on his own. To see the power of that symbol, to see the power of what it means to lean into that symbol, because it is about hope. It's about anything is possible. How hard was it for him to be that guy who had the support of his parents, was that good, and society just kept on trying to tell him that he doesn't belong at every single stage of his basketball career? He was the guy. He's the guy, right? It's unfortunate that we don't have more examples sense. But it's still important to set that mark because it doesn't necessarily even need to be about sports, right? Apply it to your own life in any capacity, right? It's so important. That Toronto buzzer beater part of the movie is like my favorite part of the movie because it's about taking your shot. I didn't even think about it from that perspective before Hassan says it like that in the movie. Because, I mean, it's about being the main character. It's not about seating the stage and being a supporting character. You are the protagonist, right? And to tell that to little Asian kids who are going to school being told don't make a noise because, they might be called China virus or Kung Fu, that is everything. And that is the power of Jeremy's example. So I'm glad that he said yes to this project and we told it this way because I think it's impacting that around the country already.
And sorry, just one thing to add on to that is like just from through some of the screenings that you've done or just through the response over the past couple of days, what are some like the most impactful moments that you felt from people who watched it or even the youth that have watched it, their response to it in terms of like what they felt?
I've had so many people come up to me in tears talking about how they felt like the story was about them. Right? I think I told that story earlier about the young woman who was like, I feel like that story made me think about every meeting I've ever been in, right? There's probably one that I actually think about the most. It's like when we premiered this at Tribeca in June, one of the screenings with the Knicks, and it was awesome. It was like we filled the room. They invited their season ticket holders. Jeremy's Foundation invited a lot of Asian American community groups in New York. And towards the end of the movie, about the section about anti-Asian violence, there's this little kid who's sitting up to the front, and he was probably no older than 10 years old. He's weeping. Well, I don't know what you were like when you were 10. Okay, I was sort of an idiot. Like I had no idea what was going on. Right? There was no movie that made me cry, unless it was like Friday the 13th or something. Right? Like I just didn't understand society on that level. And I was like, what has this kid seen the last couple of years that makes him cry that way? It broke my heart. But it made me like, that was the ultimate moment when I realized that this is actually a kid's movie. I didn't know that until then. I think we're getting a lot. I mean, if you just look up like how people are reacting to this on Twitter, on Instagram, a lot of it's just like, I'm watching this with my kid. I'm telling my kid to take the shot. I saw a tweet yesterday that was like, I just watched it with my 9-year-old son. And he said it made him feel powerful. It gives me the chills, It shows you just how important this story is to tell as many times as possible.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think like this like just like from what I've seen and just my own personal experience, obviously there's so many different demographics that Linsanity affected back in 2012, but I always said that like you never really saw that immediate change because it was really those to be parents or about to be parents that were really getting the impact. Like their kids weren't able to see that, so now like being able to experience it from this angle and also being able to experience it from an angle that's like directly related back to today's society, which is what they live in now. I think that's like what makes this impactful. Or it's like a lot of these kids, they're just called Jeremy Lin out of a stereotype, and a lot of them are like, no, I don't want to be that. And in the same way where like a lot of Jeremy Lin was probably called Yao Ming growing up, right? And so it's like they it's like a lot of them. So I've heard a lot of stories where people like are like, nah, that dude, he was a guy who just had a lot of different hairstyles, because that's like when they knew him, right? When he was like, it wasn't Linsanity, he was on the bench.
They don't remember the OG moment.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's obviously it's like when you weren't there for those 2 weeks, it's like unreplicable, right? It's like there's no way that like something like this could have happened. Even if he wasn't Asian American, obviously it would have been so huge still, right? But the fact that he was Asian American, there was no build up to this.
No.
It was just like the biggest moment in one of the biggest moments of basketball history out of nowhere, and that's what what like people can't understand really.
I just did an interview where they asked the question like, so like that must have been like a David versus Goliath moment. And I was like, David versus Goliath. Goliath knew that David existed.
Yeah.
Like Jeremy is not David. Jeremy's off the screen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like he had to, that was how far he had to go. You know, so I think it's important for us to remember the origins. You know, he ended up having a very productive, 9-year career in the NBA. How many people can say that they did that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like, I mean, this is also the difference between being a symbol and being the person, right? Jeremy, like, he talks about this all the time. Like, he's very disappointed in his NBA career. He felt like he was injured throughout his prime. He never get to do what he wanted to do. But like, when you're looking at it from my perspective, the perspective of a lot of people, like, man, you played 9 years in the NBA. Oh my God, right? Like, it's hard. I mean, it's hard for someone like him to reconcile those things, and I respect that. But when you remember the original moment, then you understand the power of the symbolism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. But yeah, no, I think those are all the questions I have for you. Are there any I know you probably like got one over everything. Is there any lasting messages that you had, or anything you felt like I didn't
No,
cover?
man, I enjoyed the conversation.